Hello! I'm the Raggedy Man, and welcome to the Trash or Treasure Guide to The Howling. This is a walkies around one of the most prominent series of werewolf films out there, other than Twilight, giving you a sniff of what to expect from the franchise and an idea of which films in it are good puppies, and which are barking up the wrong tree. The Howling started out as a series of 3 books written by Gar Brandner, the first released in 1977, which did well enough to get the attention of movie producers Michael Finnell and Jack Conrad. This is why all the movies in the series have a boilerplate on the opening credits saying they are based on those books, even if the actual connections run from thin to contractual obligations. But don't worry about that. Instead, worry about the amazing range of stories and quality that the series has to offer. Starting things off, The Howling. This is a 1981 film directed by future Gremlins director Joe Dante, and it stars Dee Wallace as a reporter who goes into the countryside to recover from her job, Jack Picardo as a psychotic werewolf who wants to kill her, and Patrick Macnee as a very nice werewolf who doesn't. The film tries to have social commentary on the news, pornography, meat-eating, industrialization, and anything else that stays still long enough for it to shake a paw at. But mostly it focuses on being really creepy in a late 70s style and having some amazing werewolf moments. It was one of 3 major werewolf movies released that year, but arguably it was the most important for the genre as it brought in new and interesting ideas. Specifically, it presented the werewolves as a species living beside man, with its own politics and culture. Through this, it has the wares as being a part of nature, rather than the unrestrained, cursed monsters of folklore and previous films. It's also an effects movie, showing off some visual gems of its era that can still hold the audience in awe today, as well as having hand-animated werewolves shagging that will most likely make you giggle. As The Howling made over a 1 in 10 return at the box office, a sequel was commissioned, and that's where the crazy really kicks in. 1985's The Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf, yes, that is its full actual title, features Christopher Lee in punk sunglasses, Annie McEnroe and Red Brown as Americans in an Ethnikistan sex dungeon, and Sybil Daneen's boobs. It's got way more in common with the sleazy erotic vampire movies of the time than the werewolf mysticism of the first movie. It has a very furry threesome and uses one single song by the band Babel as its soundtrack. So, if you like your werewolves acting like they're in a goth fetish club and your horror extra cheesy, this is for you. Just don't expect a coherent or sensible plot or a lack of racial stereotypes. Howling 3 The Marsupials came out 2 years after that and was the first of the rest of the series going straight to video. This is kind of a sequel to The Howling, but mostly just does its very own thing in a very exploitation style, including being about were-Lyceans. It continues the tradition of werewolf sex, cheap special effects, and people's faces getting eaten off for your entertainment. It's notable for having a much more sympathetic presentation of the wares than the previous films in the series, for having significantly less budget, and for cramming 20 years of plot into 94 minutes of running time. It also has Dame Edna Everage, a touching birth scene, werewolf nuns, and a section where one of the werewolves gets to star in a low-budget movie about werewolves. It's fast, it's filled with half-forms ideas, and it's absolutely both more ambitious and enjoyable than it has any rights to be. A year later, and it's Howling 4, The Original Nightmare, which is basically a remake of the first movie, but with ghost nuns in it. This time, Romy Windsor plays the exhausted suburbanite escaping to the countryside and ending up in werewolf territory, and her husband is a straight-up gaslighting prick. And it has a ghost nun that I can't get enough of. Ghost nun! It does have 2 really interesting elements which are worth mentioning. Firstly, they use really large dogs to play the werewolves in really large dog form, and that works remarkably well. Also has a really gooey transformation scene that harks back to some of the more esoteric bits of folklore. Other than that, it's pretty dull, and the first film did it all better. Howling 5, The Rebirth, is another trip to a highly stylized, this time late 80s, American idea of Eastern Europe, and it's an attempt to make a slasher flick with the werewolf as the killer. It's got a great ensemble cast, has some decent bits of gore, some really good werewolf costumes, and uses being set in a castle to maximum effect. The large list of characters gives the killer plenty to chew through, and you actually care who dies, not just how. Overall, it's pretty impressive and easily one of the highlights of the continuing series, especially if you're a fan of Hammer horror, as it took extensive notes from their 60s works. Come the 90s, come the goth angstfest that is The Howling 6, The Freaks. Brendan Hughes plays the dual role of a wandering bit of rough and the werewolf protagonist. Michelle Matheson plays the love interest, and Bruce Payne wears some seriously frilly shirts. This tries to answer the question, what if I was a mid-20s werewolf in a dead-end town who just really wanted to shag the vicar's daughter? and has Antonio Figueres, aka Huggy Bear, biting the head off a chicken. Of all the films in the series, it tries to have the most emotional range and deepest pathos, dealing with topics like social belonging and the impacts of disability. It doesn't do any of that very well, but you really have to give it points for trying. It's also got an ending which you don't see coming, and that lands pretty damn hard. Howling's New Moon Rising was the only film in the series made in the 90s, and it's just bad. Half the film is a cheap reuse of footage from the previous two movies, trying to hammer them into some kind of cohesive story that was never there. Whilst the other half is writer, director, producer, and incompetent Clive Turner dicking around with a bunch of hillbillies in a series of vignettes that range from failed comedy to failed drama. The nicest thing you can say is, at least they are consistently tedious. It's got a werewolf in there because it has to, but the final credits are the most compelling and enjoyable part of the film. And finally, so far, there is 2011's The Howling Reborn. Set in the last days of a school populated exclusively by attractive 20-somethings, it's the story of Will and Eleanor maybe being werewolves, almost certainly getting off with each other by the end of the film, and facing off against definitely a whole lot of other werewolves. Because Taylor Lautner going shirtless in Twilight made this film possible. The soundtrack is terrible, it's significantly less intelligent than it thinks it is, and midway through it pulls an apocalyptic subplot out of its arse when it absolutely doesn't need it there. Other than that, it's an okay 2010s horror film that does a couple of new things for the series, specifically being set in the city and having teenage protagonists. It's even got several decent werewolf moments and some very nice full body suits. And it has to be said, the cast really does the best it can with what it's got. Unfortunately, none of that stops the film being pretty much just, meh, okay, I guess. Overall, Netflix were in talks with Andy Muschietti to do a remake of the first film, but that was announced at the start of 2020 and nothing has been heard of since. Because have you seen what's going on? Thus, for now, we can assume this is the last of them. Unless someone else goes, I really want to not make Gary Brendanier's books into movies in a whole new way. So there you have it. 8 movies of what can be best described as an anthology series of varying quality. 1 of them is terrible, 2 are at worst mediocre, and the other 5 range from perfectly watchable to actually quite good. Overall, there is no serious through story worth mentioning, so it's not worth evaluating it as a whole. Even Your Sister is a Werewolf, the strongest attempt at a cohesive narrative between movies, has enough exposition in it that you miss nothing by not watching its predecessor, and is so stylistically different that you could easily be a fan of one and not the other. So you can safely pick and choose from the series based purely on what experience you want. If you're after quality filmmaking, then The Howling is your best bet. It's got the best cast, the best pacing, the best production values, and really is trying to say something. It's also jointly the most interesting werewolf movie. It's a bit old and carries touches of late 70s sexism through, but it's also trying to comment on society at the time, so that kind of works. As a straightforward horror movie, Rebirth is the strongest. It's got a good plot, some decent murders, and is only slightly quite racist about Eastern European culture. The cast works well, and you will be entertained throughout. For pure strangeness, you can't go wrong with the marsupials, even if you will be scratching your head at part of it. It does the most world and social building for the wares, so is joint best with The Howling for helping create a modern werewolf mythos. As said, for people after a grand narrative on Wolfenkind, or insight into building and developing a long-form story, the series has got nothing to offer. This is a set of separate films trading on an established name, with various people milking it dry for every penny to be had at different occasions, rather than anyone shepherding any ideas or overarching story along. There are more cohesive horror franchises out there to get into, and, truth be told, you'll get a better collection of werewolf movies by going outside of this run. But for an easy way to watch mostly good films in the genre, along with a couple of interesting demonstrations of its potential, it's not a bad batch to give a go if you can find them cheap. Except New Moon Rising, which is just awful.